Today is May 13th, 2026, and the number buried inside Iran's three-phase peace proposal that unlocked the ceasefire we witnessed this morning, the number that nobody in the Iranian media reporting on the proposal was willing to highlight because it is the most honest admission of strategic defeat Iran has made in 47 years, is not the enrichment percentage. It is not the mine-clearing timeline. It is not the fee structure or the sanctions release schedule or the non-aggression guarantee. The number is 30. Iran's proposal asks for the blockade to be lifted in less than 30 days. Read that number against the backdrop of a regime that survived 444 days of hostage crisis, 8 years of industrial war against Saddam Hussein's Iraq, and 2 decades of nuclear negotiations by deploying the same fundamental weapon in every crisis it ever faced: time. The Islamic Republic's most reliable strategic asset was never its military, never its proxies, never its nuclear program, never its Hormuz leverage. It was its institutional willingness to wait while adversaries grew tired, elections changed governments, political pressure shifted, and the cost of sustained confrontation accumulated on the other side until accommodation became preferable to continuation. That doctrine worked across 7 American presidential administrations. It worked because time was always on Iran's side, and now it is not. And the proof of that is not a satellite image or a military assessment or an intelligence report. It is a number. 30 days. The regime that outlasted every adversary by outlasting them is asking for relief in less than a month because the physics of its own oil infrastructure has imposed a deadline that no diplomatic patience can negotiate around. The blockade has not just closed Iran's ports. It has closed the 47-year strategic playbook that kept the Islamic Republic alive through every previous crisis. And the B-52s that turned around this morning turned around because Tehran finally communicated, through the specific deadline embedded in its proposal, that the clock that was always supposed to run in its favor is now running against it. But let's back all the way up. Because to understand why the 30-day deadline in Iran's proposal is the most strategically revealing data point this conflict has produced, and why the combination of Operation Economic Fury, the UAE's financial cooperation, the Pakistani border leakage, and Trump's specific language about 47 years of unpaid cost all converge into the picture that forced Iran to the table with a deadline in its own peace proposal, you need to understand exactly what the economic strangulation looks like from inside Iran right now. Here is where things stand as of May 13th, 2026, in the hours following the ceasefire announcement. The ceasefire is real. The bombers turned around. The strait is opening through coordinated passage routes. And every economic mechanism that produced the ceasefire is still running, because the ceasefire does not lift the blockade. It pauses the bombing. The blockade continues at full enforcement. The daily revenue loss continues at the $500 million rate that has been compounding since April 13th. Operation Economic Fury, the Treasury Department's sprint toward the finish line that Secretary Bessent described as suffocating the regime and leaving it unable to pay its soldiers, continues at full operational intensity. The UAE's cooperation in identifying and freezing IRGC-connected accounts continues, and the oil that was filling the storage tanks at Kharg Island toward their physical ceiling is now beginning to find some relief through the coordinated passage the ceasefire's strait opening provides, but not the full relief that a lifted blockade would produce, because the blockade has not been lifted. The economic weapon that forced the deadline into Iran's proposal is still operational. The ceasefire bought time for diplomacy. It did not buy relief from the pressure that made the deadline necessary. Now let's talk about what the signals from inside Iran have been telling the intelligence community about the economic condition that produced a 30-day deadline in a peace proposal from a regime that spent 47 years measuring time in years and decades rather than months and weeks. The Ministry of Industry, Mine and Trade warning about car prices is the first signal worth understanding in its specific domestic political context. An Iranian government ministry warning consumers to be careful about buying cars, because recent price increases come from artificial market manipulation rather than any real economic basis, is not a consumer protection communication. It is the regime's public acknowledgement that the blockade's effects are reaching the civilian economy at a level visible enough in the car market, where prices are an easily observed barometer of purchasing power and economic confidence, that the government felt compelled to address it before the observation became a political narrative it could not manage. The same ministry confirmed plans to import used cars. Iran is a country with a domestic automotive manufacturing industry. The announcement of plans to import used cars is the industrial equivalent of a government admitting it cannot maintain the domestic manufacturing ecosystem that produces new cars at the volume and price point the market requires. Used car imports are what governments reach for when domestic production capacity is stressed beyond what the normal subsidy and support architecture can address. The crude output reduction is the signal that concentrates the entire economic picture into its single most consequential dimension. Tehran has started cutting crude output early to avoid hitting storage limits, Not because demand has fallen, not because wells are naturally declining, not because any normal production management consideration has changed, but because the blockade has closed the export routes and the storage tanks are filling toward their physical ceiling. The official description of this as precautionary is accurate in a specific and devastating sense. It is precautionary against the catastrophic outcome that storage capacity reaching maximum forces. When tanks are full and wells cannot stop producing, the oil has nowhere to go. The pressure in the infrastructure systems builds to levels that require emergency procedures. And if no emergency procedure is adequate, the wells must be shut in under conditions that produce the permanent geological damage that makes restarting them an engineering problem, measured in billions of dollars and years of work, rather than the operational decision that the official described as turning them back on quickly. Iran is managing the approach to catastrophe by reducing the rate of approach. That is the honest description of what precautionary output cuts mean in the context of a blockade that has closed the exit routes from full storage tanks. The industry spokesperson's assurance that Iran has enough experience and is not concerned should be evaluated against what the ministry is actually doing, which is reducing oil production in an oil-producing country, because the blockade has left nowhere to put the oil that normal production would generate. Now let's get into Secretary Bessent's specific account of Operation Economic Fury, because his description of the Treasury Department's role in this conflict is the clearest public articulation of how the financial strangulation mechanism operates and why it is more comprehensive and more targeted than any previous sanctions campaign against Iran. He described the progression from maximum pressure to economic fury as the shift from running a marathon to sprinting toward the finish line. The marathon was the 12 months of sustained sanctions pressure. The sprint is the 3-week-old directive from Trump to Treasury to move from measured sanctions enforcement to an all-hands-on-deck financial suffocation operation. The specific claim that the regime is unable to pay its soldiers is not rhetorical. It is a financial system assessment based on Treasury's visibility into the payment flows that the IRGC depends on to maintain its personnel infrastructure. An organization that cannot pay its soldiers consistently has soldiers who are performing their own cost-benefit calculation about the risk they are accepting in exchange for compensation that is not reliably arriving. That calculation spreading through the lower ranks of the security apparatus at the same time that the protest conditions Sabeti publicly acknowledged are waiting behind the internet blackout for the coordination tool that would allow them to reconstitute is the combination that makes the domestic stability picture as fragile as the financial picture. The UAE cooperation story is the element of the economic warfare that represents Iran's own most consequential strategic miscalculation of the entire conflict. For years, the UAE financial system had been what Bessent diplomatically described as somewhat permissive in allowing IRGC-connected entities to operate within it. Dubai's banking infrastructure, its commercial real estate, its shell company ecosystem had all been accessible to IRGC-connected entities, operating under cover names and intermediary structures designed to place Iranian regime money in a jurisdiction connected to the global dollar clearing system. This was not a secret. American intelligence knew about it. American Treasury officials knew about it. The calculation that allowed it to continue was a balance of diplomatic and economic relationships that made direct confrontation of UAE permissiveness more costly than the sustained tolerance of it. And then Iran fired 2,000 missiles and drones at the UAE. The UAE absorbed those strikes, activated its THAAD and Patriot defense systems, intercepted most of them, watched its Fujairah oil terminal take a direct hit, and then made a decision that no diplomatic communication from any American administration could have produced through negotiation. UAE officials came forward proactively, provided the details of IRGC-connected accounts in the UAE banking system, and authorized the United States to freeze those assets. 47 years of IRGC financial infrastructure building inside the UAE financial system was handed to the American Treasury because the IRGC bombed its way into the worst possible response from the country, whose financial cooperation was essential to its offshore asset security. Bessent described this as the IRGC watching its stolen assets get frozen and go down the drain very quickly. The assets are gone. The financial infrastructure that moved them and protected them is gone, and they were surrendered not by American diplomatic pressure, but by IRGC missiles that turned the UAE from a permissive host into an active intelligence partner overnight. The Pakistani border leakage is the honest complication in the otherwise comprehensive economic strangulation picture, and it deserves the honest proportionality assessment that the coverage of it has sometimes misapplied. Trucks and motorbikes crossing the Iran-Pakistan border, moving goods in both directions outside the formal trade channels that the blockade has severed, represent a real bypass of the blockade's comprehensive intent. The visual of these smuggling convoys suggests an Iranian economy finding alternative supply routes that undermine the strangulation strategy's completeness. The math of that suggestion is less alarming than the visuals imply. A single Iranian tanker carries approximately 2 million barrels of crude oil. Every motorbike in the convoy crossing the Pakistani border is carrying some fraction of what a 5-gallon bucket holds at most. You would need 17,000 motorbikes carrying those 5-gallon containers in continuous operation to replace the cargo of a single tanker. Iran's daily oil exports before the blockade were approximately 1.5 to 2 million barrels. The motorbike and truck smuggling across the Pakistani border is not replacing that. It is providing some survivability margin at the edges of the supply system: food, fuel for generators, consumer goods that the blockade has cut off from formal import channels. It is the difference between a population experiencing complete supply collapse and a population experiencing severe shortages managed by whatever informal supply reaches them through the mountain passes. It is real. It is not strategically decisive. It is the leakage that extends the timeline slightly without changing the direction of travel. Trump's response, when asked about the Pakistan smuggling situation, is the diplomatic reality that constrains the closure of this leakage. He expressed great respect for Pakistan's Field Marshal and Prime Minister. He did not announce secondary sanctions against Pakistan for the border smuggling. He did not announce any enforcement action against the Pakistani military's financial interests in the smuggling corridor. The reason is straightforward. Pakistan is simultaneously the primary diplomatic channel through which Iranian ceasefire communications have been reaching American decision-makers. Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif and Field Marshal Asim Munir are the specific Pakistani officials whose mediation Trump acknowledged in his ceasefire statement this morning. An administration that is using Pakistani mediation to manage the diplomatic track of the most consequential military confrontation in the Middle East since 2003 cannot simultaneously impose economic penalties on Pakistan's military for managing the smuggling corridor that generates the revenue that sustains that military's institutional interests. The two requirements, Pakistani diplomatic cooperation and Pakistani border enforcement, are in direct tension, and the administration has prioritized the diplomatic cooperation. That is a rational choice. It is also a choice that means the Pakistani border leakage will continue at roughly its current scale for as long as Pakistan's mediation role is operationally important. The leakage is the price of the mediation. The mediation is worth more than the leakage costs. That is the calculation Trump's answer reflected, without explicitly articulating it. Now let's get into the three-phase proposal in its specific operational detail, because understanding each phase tells you which elements are the regime's institutional survival requirements, dressed as diplomatic proposals, and which elements represent genuine movement toward a framework the American position could accommodate. Phase 1 envisions a gradual opening of the Strait of Hormuz and lifting of the U.S. naval siege on Iranian ports, with Iran taking charge of dealing with sea mines. That last clause is the element that the American negotiating team will have examined most carefully, because offering Iran charge of the mine-clearing operation in the Strait it mined is offering Iran operational control of the navigational safety of a waterway through which 20% of global oil moves during the period when American ships that have been executing the blockade would be vulnerable if the mine-clearing process was less than fully transparent and fully verified. The American response has been the deployment of additional mine countermeasure vessels and the announcement that American mine-clearing operations will proceed independently of Iranian coordination. That response answers the mine-clearing proposal without accepting the operational control dimension that makes Iran's proposal for its own mine-clearing unacceptable as a framework. Phase 2 is where the nuclear file appears in the form that reveals what Iran considers acceptable and what it is structurally incapable of accepting, given the IRGC's institutional survival calculation. The proposal offers a return to enrichment at 67%, which is the JCPOA level after a specified period, under a zero storage principle that would prevent Iran from accumulating enriched uranium while enriching at that level. The proposal explicitly rejects dismantling nuclear infrastructure or destroying Iran's facilities. Read the structure of that offer carefully. Iran is offering to temporarily not enrich above JCPOA levels and to not store what it produces during the pause. It is explicitly not offering to destroy the infrastructure that could resume higher enrichment when the pause ends. The American requirement, as Trump has described it, is to eliminate Iran's missile-making capability, including the remaining 15% that survived the first round's strikes, and to address the enrichment program in a way that prevents Iran from having a nuclear weapon. Those two requirements are not satisfied by a temporary enrichment pause that preserves the underlying infrastructure in place for reconstitution when the pause expires. The gap between what Iran's Phase 2 offers and what the American position requires is the nuclear negotiating gap that has prevented every previous agreement over 2 decades. The Phase 2 proposal closes some of the distance. It does not reach the American requirement, and the IRGC's institutional logic prohibits crossing the remaining distance because crossing it eliminates the deterrence justification that makes the IRGC's governing role defensible. Phase 3 is the element of the proposal that tells you how much Iran's strategic self-assessment has changed since February 28th. Proposing to enter strategic dialogue with Arab neighbors to build a security system for the entire Middle East is a proposal that comes from the same country that was firing missiles and drones at those Arab neighbors 30 days before the proposal was submitted. The Gulf states receiving this proposal, the UAE that provided IRGC account details to the U.S. Treasury, the Saudi Arabia that has been rerouting crude through the Red Sea pipeline to avoid depending on Iranian Strait goodwill, the Qatar that warned of force majeure if the conflict continued, are processing an offer of strategic dialogue from an organization whose most recent strategic engagement with them was kinetic. The proposal's third phase is not a serious regional architecture initiative. It is the diplomatic language that fills the space in a three-part document that needs something to put in part 3 after parts 1 and 2 have stated what Iran needs and what Iran will offer. What Iran is willing to offer in phase 3 is a conversation. What Iran's Arab neighbors are interested in discussing is whether Iran's missile inventory will be pointed at them again the next time the IRGC's institutional interests require demonstrating regional power. Trump's comments before the ceasefire was agreed, specifically his Truth Social post that he cannot imagine the proposal would be acceptable, and that Iran has not paid a big enough price for what it has done to humanity and the world over the last 47 years, are the most important public signal about the administration's negotiating posture that exists in the public record. Read the 47 years reference, not the current conflict, not the nuclear program specifically, not any single episode of Iranian conduct. 47 years. That framing situates the current negotiation not as a resolution of the 2026 conflict, but as a settlement of a cumulative account that began with the 1979 revolution and has been building through every hostage crisis, every proxy operation, every nuclear negotiation delay, every Hormuz threat, every attack on Gulf partners, every decade of IRGC financial predation of the Iranian people's national resources. A president who frames the question as 47 years of unpaid cost is not going to accept a proposal that offers a temporary enrichment pause and mine clearing by Iran's own forces as the settlement of that account. He is going to accept a proposal that addresses the underlying capability and the underlying governance structure that has produced 47 years of the conduct being settled. That requirement is fundamentally incompatible with the IRGC's institutional survival calculation. And the ceasefire that the bombers turning around today reflects is not a resolution of that incompatibility. It is a 14-day window in which both sides are calculating whether the incompatibility can be resolved through creative framework construction, or whether it must be resolved through the resumption of the military track that has been putting 47 years of accumulated institutional power on the wrong side of the ledger every day since February 28th. The 85% missile capability elimination figure is Trump's public account of what the first round accomplished against the single dimension of Iranian military power that the IRGC cannot afford to concede in any framework that preserves its governing role. The remaining 15% is not just the 15% of missile production infrastructure that survived the first round. It is the institutional justification that the nuclear program and the missile program together provide for the IRGC's claim to a governing role that goes beyond conventional military function. A conventional military provides defense. An organization with a nuclear program and a ballistic missile force provides deterrence that justifies a governing role above the civilian institutions the Constitution designates as supreme. Strip the nuclear program and the missile capability, and what you have is a very powerful domestic security force, with no argument for why it should also govern. Trump said he would like to eliminate the rest. That preference, if executed, produces not just military degradation, but the removal of the institutional justification that makes the IRGC's political dominance defensible in any internal Iranian governance conversation. The IRGC knows this. Its resistance to the proposal elements that would address these capabilities is not strategic stubbornness. It is institutional self-preservation performing as negotiating position. Now, let's bring the complete economic picture together into the assessment of what the 30-day deadline in Iran's proposal actually tells you about the regime's remaining strategic capacity. The blockade is costing Iran $500 million per day in combined import and export capacity denial. The storage tanks at Kharg Island reached 85% of capacity before the ceasefire's straight opening began to provide some relief. The wells have been producing below normal to manage the approach to storage ceiling. Operation Economic Fury has been running for 3 weeks, supplementing the blockade with the Treasury Department's all-hands-on-deck effort to freeze offshore IRGC assets and cut off financial flows that were sustaining the regime's soldier payments. The UAE has turned from permissive to active financial partner in the asset freezing operation. The Pakistani border provides a smuggling corridor that extends the timeline slightly without changing the direction of travel. The proxy network across Hezbollah, the Houthis, and Iraqi militias is losing its financial oxygen and beginning its organizational collapse as the funding that sustained it stops arriving from an IRGC that cannot pay its own soldiers. And the domestic population, 85 million people living under a 75-day internet blackout that the regime's own lawmakers publicly acknowledged is designed to prevent protest organization rather than to protect military communications, is at the threshold of the economic and political conditions that produced the January 2026 uprising that killed over 3,000 people in its suppression. This is the condition of the Islamic Republic that produced the 30-day deadline in its peace proposal. Not tactical patience, not strategic calculation. Physical necessity, the tanks are filling, the wells are cutting output, the soldiers are not being paid, the proxies are starving, the population is at the breaking point, and the regime that survived 444 days of hostage crisis and 8 years of industrial warfare is asking for blockade relief in less than a month because the weapon its adversaries have finally deployed against it is not a weapon it has the institutional DNA to wait out. It is the physics of its own oil tanks filling toward their physical ceiling, and physics does not negotiate. Now, let's get into the honest assessment of what the 30-day deadline means for the 14-day ceasefire clock that began when the B-52s turned around this morning. Iran embedded a 30-day relief requirement in its peace proposal because the oil infrastructure physics required it. The American negotiating team observed that embedded deadline and understood precisely what it communicated about the Iranian decision-making urgency that the blockade had produced. The ceasefire that followed, offering Iranian agreement to open the strait in exchange for a 2-week bombing pause and a negotiating window, is the American response to that observed urgency. The administration is using the deadline Iran revealed against itself by accepting the minimum concession, the strait opening that was always the stated American precondition for any diplomatic framework, in exchange for the maximum leverage, a 2-week clock in which Iran must produce the nuclear and missile concessions that the 30-day deadline demonstrates it cannot afford to let expire. The ceasefire is not a mutual concession. It is the American recognition that Iran's 30-day deadline creates a negotiating pressure window that the military track's continuation would eliminate by producing the well shutdown before the diplomatic track could capitalize on Iran's acknowledged urgency. The bombing pause preserves the oil infrastructure that the ceasefire window's negotiation requires Iran to be protecting rather than losing. You cannot use the threat of oil infrastructure damage to compel concessions if the infrastructure is already being destroyed by resumed strikes. The ceasefire pauses the destruction to preserve the leverage the destruction represents. The 47-year patience doctrine is dead. The Islamic Republic that survived every crisis by waiting longer than its adversaries has just submitted a peace proposal with a 30-day deadline. That submission is the single most honest communication the regime has made about its strategic condition since February 28th. Secretary Bessent said they are sprinting toward the finish line. Iran's 30-day deadline is the regime's public acknowledgement that the sprint is reaching a distance it cannot run indefinitely. The finish line is not yet visible, but the runner's stride is shortening and the pace is flagging in ways that the proposal's specific deadline makes impossible to conceal through the public composure of official statements that insist on confidence and readiness. Officials say the industry has enough experience and is not concerned. Meanwhile, they are cutting oil production because the storage tanks are filling. Officials say they are fully prepared for renewed hostilities. Meanwhile, they are asking for blockade relief in less than 30 days. Watch what they do, not what they say. And what they are doing is asking for the thing that proves the 47-year playbook has been broken by the one weapon it was never designed to withstand. Not military force, not diplomatic isolation, not proxy degradation. A blockade that fills oil tanks toward a geological deadline that no amount of strategic patience can postpone, and that reveals in a peace proposal's specific deadline exactly how much time the most time-patient regime in the modern history of regional conflict has left to play with. 30 days. That is the number. Everything else is commentary. Drop your assessment in the comments. Does the 30-day deadline in Iran's proposal mean the ceasefire's 14-day clock produces the final agreement before the storage physics forces the decision? Or does the IRGC's institutional resistance to nuclear concessions mean the deadline arrives without a resolution and the bombers turn around again? Subscribe and turn on notifications. The physics clock and the diplomatic clock are now running simultaneously, and the next update will tell you which one reaches its threshold first.